Hello, hello, everybody. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for your patience as we work with technology. And can everyone hear me okay? Okay, I'll be closer. Thank you. Welcome to the American Philosophical Society's Our Lunch at the Library series. My name is Brian Carpenter. I am the curator of Indigenous materials here at the APS Library and Museum. We're really glad to have you here today. Please, when you can, get to your seat and silence your cell phones. And like me, when you get to your food, try not to crunch. I'll try not to crunch my potato chips too loudly when I get to them. So a little bit of background if you're not familiar with the American Philosophical Society. The society is the oldest learned society in the United States, founded in 1743 by Benjamin Franklin for the purpose of promoting useful knowledge. You'll hear that phrase a lot in APS Things. Today, we sustain this mission in three main ways. We honor and engage leading scholars, scientists, and professionals through elected membership and opportunities for interdisciplinary intellectual fellowship, and particularly with meetings we hold twice a year. We support research and discovery through grants and fellowships, lectures, publications, prizes, exhibitions, public education. Please do go to the museum exhibition right now, it's wonderful. And we serve scholars through a research library of manuscripts and other collections internationally recognized for its enduring historic value. And we would also like to acknowledge that the APS resides here in Lenapehoking, which is the past, present, and ongoing homeland of Lenape people. And we also acknowledge the ongoing presence of Lenape people despite centuries of land theft, persecution, and other forces. And the society also recognized that it has benefited from being an occupant of this part of Lenape land now called Philadelphia. And as an organization that is literally founded next to the seat of colonial power in Pennsylvania, and that has many founders and leaders who were officials and even presidents of those colonial powers that expedited Indigenous removal, the society recognizes the importance of speaking about this history honestly and carrying itself forward now in a spirit of welcome and collaboration. So because of that, through our Center of Native American and Indigenous Research, which I'm the head of, the Society seeks to promote research that honors Indigenous knowledge, cultivates scholarship, and strengthens languages and cultural traditions. And we want to express our sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of numerous Indigenous communities and individuals who have offered guidance, expertise, and opportunities for collaboration that have made this work possible. So I'll say as an ad lib also that if you're not familiar with that part of the APS library, the APS collections has materials from throughout North America, predominantly. It is one of the largest collections of Indigenous language, historical materials, documentation, on the continent. And our center, CNAIR for short, there's brochures in the back if you'd like more information. We're the main contact point for people wanting to work with those materials. The majority of our requests are from Indigenous communities themselves, as well as scholars in many fields. And we'd be glad to be in touch with anyone who would like more information about those collections and to do research. So I would now like to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Lynn Smith is a historical anthropologist whose research explores settler colonialism and social memory. She's a professor of anthropology at Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania. She has published widely on French settler colonialism and the role of place loss in forging community. Her book, Colonial Memory and Post-Colonial Europe, Maltese Settlers in Algeria and France, received the Douglas Prize from the Society for Anthropology of Europe, and she's currently working on a book project on public and private memories of the walking purchase of 1737, which removed the Lenape from eastern Pennsylvania. Today, she will be speaking on her new book, of which we have copies in the back, and which I hear will be coming out in paperback soon as well. Memory Wars, Settlers and Natives Remember Washington's Sullivan Expedition of 1779, which contrasts public history of the Revolutionary War, of this Revolutionary War expedition, with its narration at Haudenosaunee cultural centers in central New York today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Smith.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction. Can you hear me okay? Now you can? Okay. So I wanted to thank the American Philosophical Society for the invitation. It's really an honor to be here. And I'd like to thank everybody who's here now. So how do we remember the Revolutionary War? With the 250th anniversary coming up, oh, here's my thing. We've been thinking about this a lot. You've been probably going to museum exhibits, watching films, watching Ken Burns. And as a memory scholar, I'm really interested in thinking about what stories we decide to tell and whose stories are left out. I'm also interested in public markers. Commemorative markers can be an unseen kind of backdrop for everyday life, but sometimes people will call attention to them, and we've all seen how conflicts over difficult pasts, like the slavery or the Civil War, have emerged. The events of the Revolutionary War usually aren't considered in these kinds of discussions. Instead, the events of the Revolutionary War are usually called upon to bring about national unity. The foundational conflict and its protagonists have been celebrated by national leaders, and some of its actors serve as sources of inspiration and insight, as our founding fathers, our revolutionary demigods, central figures in a conflict that serves as a source of the nation's moral values. And so people often use the Revolutionary War to kind of build consensus during times of strife. But this war was also a moment of horror, or had moments of horror, betrayal, and trickery and despair, leading some scholars to refer to it as America's first Civil War. While the perspective of enslaved and freed Africans and pacifists and loyalists now receive more attention, often neglected in discussions of the Revolutionary War is the war's complex meanings for Native Americans. In many parts of the country, the war removed Native peoples from the land. I just want to show some, and leading to land grabs of unimaginable scale with unforgettable consequences. How do we tell these aspects of the war? Do they appear in our literature? As a colonial scholar, I'm also interested in how the Revolutionary War dovetails with the ongoing settler colonial project that was foundational to this nation. So in celebrating this war, are we also celebrating settler colonialism? This intersection of settler colonialism and the Revolutionary War, the seizure of Native American lands and Revolutionary War, is sometimes best illustrated by maps. So this map of British forces in 1766 outlines in part what was at stake with the rebellion, the lands to the west of the Proclamation Line, which is mentioned here, depicted here as lands reserved for the Indians. So my book is looking at these issues through a discussion of what is often called Sullivan's Expedition. This was a military expedition in 1779. It was at the time known as Washington's Indian Expedition. It was a scorched earth mission that traveled straight into the homelands of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois at the time. So you may have, Haudenosaunee. The troops destroyed, if you count all the different forays, at least 50 Haudenosaunee villages. So how does one remember that kind of an event? Should it be remembered? Should we have place names or statues commemorating a scorched earth expedition? So my book is looking at these topics. I want to show you some of the markers that I ended up looking at. So across 2 states, there are markers to the Sullivan Expedition. They're put up at different times by different people. They seem to tell a story of loss, Native American loss and decline. Here's another one. So in looking at these markers, my book builds on insights from this really amazing book by White Earth Ojibwe scholar Jean O'Brien. She studied New England local histories, And she found that they engage in what she calls firsting and lasting. These are rhetorical devices that present the New England settlers as the kind of first people coming to an area. And you've probably seen in your travels markers to the first church, the first, baby born or whatever, as if there weren't babies before these times. So she talks about this as firsting, elevating the settlers as the first people worthy of note, and then also engaging in lasting, where there may be markers to the last of this tribe or that tribe. And that's another trope that's really common in American literature, like Last of the Mohicans and so forth. And together, she argues, these create a kind of replacement narrative, a settler mythology that suggests that Native people are a vanishing people, soon to become extinct, and history commences with the white people who arrived to replace them. When you look at some of these Sullivan markers, it seems that they are sometimes engaging a little bit in this kind of lasting narrative. And so I'll be using these terms throughout this talk, especially talking about replacement narratives. What kind of replacement narratives are people telling? So what I'll be doing today is first I'll be giving you a little bit of an overview of the Sullivan Expedition, and then I'll talk about the kind of research I did for the book, the kind of findings I came up with, and then I'll turn to how the story is told at Haudenosaunee cultural centers, which is a very different kind of story from the story that you see on the historical markers. So in 1778, the war was not going very well. There were also a new ranger group, Butler's Rangers, who were carrying out guerrilla attacks in the frontier areas. So you can see here in what in the map is called English territory, there were lots of different attacks being carried out. And it was creating some panic. It was hard to get men to serve. They wanted to stay home to protect their families. And Washington was getting a lot of pressure. And finally, Congress ordered him to respond. He decided to send troops into an area that was poorly known, and it was the homelands of what is known as the Six Nations, Iroquois, or the Haudenosaunee. And in this 1771 map, you can see here that there isn't a lot of detail because this was an area that was relatively unknown to the outsiders. Okay. The Confederacy held a vast territory, but by 1778, some Oneidas and Tuscaroras were assisting the Patriot faction, while the largest nation, the Senecas, Cayugas, and the Mohawks, were increasingly involved in these British loyalist attacks. Before that time, before 1778, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy really tried to stay out of the Revolutionary War, which they saw as a kind of battle between brothers. So Washington's goal was to eliminate the threat posed by some of these Haudenosaunee warriors. And he spent months planning this mission, and some people say it was one of the most carefully planned missions that he ever carried out. He devoted a quarter of the Continental Army to move into this territory, and this is a map from the expedition, and I wanted to show this map because you can also see how very little is known about the area that they're heading into. So this ends up being a massive affair with thousands of men, probably close to 5,000 altogether, involving bateaus to transport supplies, thousands of horses, cattle, artillery, foodstuffs, and so forth. And they're traveling up the rivers into the Haudenosaunee homeland. The goal, Washington argued, was to destroy every single village. And so here is Washington's orders to John Sullivan, and I just put some parts in highlight. So the immediate objective to destroy every settlement, capture as many prisoners, ruin the crops in the ground, and all stored foodstuffs. And he also said, don't listen to any overtures for peace until you've destroyed all of their food and make sure that they can't plant any more. So they were attacking very well-established villages with log cabins and glass windows and incredibly fertile lands with massive amounts of corn and so forth. Often settlements that were far nicer than what the soldiers were used to. And they had to spend time burning it to the ground. Sometimes it took 3 days at one village because there was so much material to destroy, and the soldiers called it a weird war against vegetables. So it was, very odd. The reason why they were fighting the vegetables is because the Haudenosaunee leaders evacuated villages in advance of this massive army. They could certainly hear it coming, thousands of people marching and cows bellowing and so forth. And so they evacuated the village to preserve civilian life. So Sullivan's troops only engaged in really one major battle and suffered very few casualties. There was one ambush that could have succeeded but didn't. And I put this map up again to show you that General Broadhead led troops on the left-hand side towards, in western Pennsylvania, also carrying out the destruction of about 11 Seneca towns. And Van Schaik started the whole series of raids off in upper right corner. So in April was Van Schaik, and then Broadhead and Sullivan and Clinton were supposed to meet up and take Niagara. So from the vantage point of Sullivan and his men, this was a remarkable success. But from the vantage point of the indigenous inhabitants of these villages, it was a disaster. So the Haudenosaunee fled. Thousands of 5,000 people or more fled to Fort Niagara, where they lived in this long kind of series of settlements outside of the fort throughout the winter. And it was one of the hardest winters in record. And so hundreds of people, we're not quite sure how many, died of either starvation or the elements or disease. Okay, so that's the Sullivan Expedition, or the Washington's Indian Expedition. It has since been named the Sullivan Expedition after the major general in charge, but some people say that also removes kind of Washington from responsibility. Historians today are mixed about the long-term consequences of this expedition. Sullivan's troops were supposed to meet up and take Niagara, and they didn't do that. They also didn't capture that many prisoners that they were going to use for bargaining later. Moreover, and I put some of these because Sullivan didn't have a really great reputation, so I put that middle book in there. Moreover, Haudenosaunee raids on the settlements continued after the Sullivan Expedition. So Haudenosaunee came back to nearby areas and carried out further raids. Colin Calloway in this excellent book counts up how many different towns and storehouses of corn were destroyed by the Haudenosaunee with the Loyalists and Butler's Rangers, and finds that Sullivan's expedition actually generated more attacks than fewer because they were pissed off. So with this background, the question that is kind of the question of my book is who would decide to commemorate it, and how would they decide to commemorate it, and when would they decide to commemorate it? So now I'm going to turn to how I did this project. So on my college campus, there is a very small kind of nondescript marker to the Sullivan Expedition. And it marks the path taken by the troops as they headed north. Were there more, I wondered. And so I started about 15 years ago to start digging into this to see, was this the only one, or are there others? And as I started traveling and meeting with people, I found, boy, there are a lot more. So my first task was reconnaissance. And you can see here, some of the markers were large stone monuments. Other times they're roadside signs. They took different forms. They were put together by different people at different times, never under federal oversight. Oftentimes people would put up markers in their own yard without, even state or anybody else overseeing what they were going to say. And so I did work up and down this area that's sometimes known as Sullivan's Trail. I ended up visiting a lot of archives because the history of the markers hadn't been written. I thought what I would be doing is comparing how people deal with the markers with the story of the markers told in history books, but there were no history books about the Sullivan campaign markers. And so I created a database of markers, trying to figure out exactly how many there were. And then I did a lot of ethnographic research, which for an anthropologist means spending time in local communities, attending historical events, walking tours, founders days, powwows, anything, and then talking to people at these events, and then interviewing people of different ages, mostly older people. People would often bring me the oldest person they knew so I could talk to them, and then interview them and talk about this past. I also went on river sojourns where people were commemorating the Sullivan Expedition by going on a river tour of, following where the troops went. There are also people reenacting this expedition, and so I attended these reenactments. So what I found through this research is that the Sullivan Expedition is definitely commemorated a lot, and it may be the Revolutionary War event celebrated with the most historical markers in the United States. I found over 200 in New York, about 250, and there are over 50 in Pennsylvania. And so I've been working on a website that has a map, and this is depicts kind of where they are, you can see. So I realized I was dealing with more than just a handful of markers, so I refer to this in the book as a commemorative project, or complex. And here are some images. So you can see a lot of markers went up at anniversaries, especially the 150th anniversary. So we're now at a 250th anniversary, so it's kind of interesting to know how people are going to commemorate this now. These large stone markers ended up being road hazards, especially as automobile travel started to increase and people started to travel faster, and so the state started putting up these metal signs afterwards. And then there are also many roads named after the Sullivan Expedition, so this is also part of this commemorative project. I also learned through this research that this is not something from yesteryear. I thought when I was looking at the sort of nondescript marker on my college campus that people might not know much about the Sullivan Expedition, but I soon found that there are actually new markers going up. And so I attended one of these marker dedications in Bear Creek Township in Pennsylvania. Then part of this research was also, and this is just, I'm kind of going through the slides fast, so it's kind of hard for the camera folks, but I also visited several Haudenosaunee cultural centers. So even though the markers tend to give you a sense that Sullivan came through and destroyed this village and the people are gone and they vanished, you actually have, thriving Haudenosaunee Confederacy that continues to meet with reservations and cultural centers all in the same area where the historical markers are. And so I was really interested to know, how do the cultural centers deal with this history? What kind of story do they narrate? And so I spent time at the cultural centers and interviewed the directors or the founders of these centers. So what did I find out? The book is organized into sections. And the first part I want to talk about, I'm not going to be able to talk about every section here, so I'm going to talk about a little bit about the origins of the markers, and then I'll talk about the Haudenosaunee interventions. The part about this project that most surprised me was how different the story is told by the markers in Pennsylvania and New York. This is one military expedition. You would think that you would have one narrative, but you have local politics and local contexts shaping the story in really distinctive ways. And so that's the first thing I'll be telling you about. And so you really could see, first of all, they have different starting times when they're telling their story, and I'll explain how. They also call it two different things. So you can see the markers in Pennsylvania talk about the Sullivan Expedition. In New York, it's called the Sullivan-Clinton Campaign. And not only that, you have Clinton on the left and Sullivan on the right, so they're kind of equal. So in Pennsylvania, I will argue, and this gets a little complicated, but I'll try to explain it. Pennsylvania tells the story of the Sullivan Expedition in relationship to the Battle of Wyoming. So I argue that it's in the shadow of Wyoming. Wyoming is a town in Pennsylvania. The word itself comes from a Lenape word. The state of Wyoming is actually commemorating that battle as well. Okay, so, and when I was first doing research in these historical societies in the towns in Pennsylvania, I would tell people I was interested in the story of the Sullivan Expedition, and people would hand me books about the Yankee-Pennamite War or the Wyoming Massacre. And I would say, thank you, but I know I'm studying the Sullivan Expedition. And I didn't realize that they were actually answering my question. Because in these regions of Pennsylvania, the Battle of Wyoming is the reason for the Sullivan Expedition. They're seen as two parts of the same story. One is sort of the cause, and the other is the consequence. And so I had to really study what that battle was all about. So this was a Revolutionary War battle. You know, locally, it's often referred to as the Wyoming Massacre, and so you don't really realize it's part of the Revolutionary War. It was a Revolutionary War battle where, in brief, Patriot side came out of a fort early and got caught in an ambush, and there were 300 Patriot dead and hardly any on the other side, maybe 3. Many of the actors on the British side were Native Americans. So immediately in the aftermath of the battle, you had newspaper accounts telling a totally different story, presenting this as a kind of raid of the whole town, thousands of women and children killed, you know, just really kind of, the stories get kind of exaggerated. In fact, only men in arms were killed at this battle, right? But the story of this Indian massacre is really important in northern Pennsylvania. That's one thing. Then the other point is that many of the markers were established in these particular areas by Daughters of the American Revolution chapters, and I was curious about that, so I looked into the chapters. I found that this really is about the Yankee-Pennamite War, which is a previous conflict over this strip of Pennsylvania. Connecticut and Pennsylvania were promised the same strip of land. They fought over it before the Revolutionary War. The Connecticut Yankees came down. They set up settlements. That's what they were called in the region, the Connecticut Yankees. Set up towns, were demographically victorious. The Pennsylvania authorities kept trying to kick them out, bring them to jail, and so forth. They went back and forth and back and forth. By 1778, most of the Pennsylvania partisans had left the area. So during the Battle of Wyoming, most of the people who were killed were originally from Connecticut. So the Battle of Wyoming becomes this kind of Connecticut martyrdom story that continues on after the Revolutionary War. You know that that's not part of Connecticut now, right? So the Connecticut partisans were not victorious in claiming that piece of the state, but they were victorious demographically. And so these women who are in the DAR chapters are actually women of Connecticut ancestry. They have people in their family, they're descendants of people who died in the Battle of Wyoming, and they really want to bring that out whenever they can. And so they put up markers to the Sullivan Expedition in which people are talking about the wailing and moaning of the people being killed during the Battle of Wyoming. And then, so that's why we have the Sullivan Expedition, end of story. So the focus of the markers, the focus of the commemorative practice in Pennsylvania tends to be on the Wyoming battle, described as a massacre, and much less about the Sullivan Expedition. And you find even today at these celebrations a kind of the painting of an image of a Native American that's kind of a vicious savage. And so you can see this image on brochures for the commemoration of the Battle of Wyoming, you know, next July. You know, it happens again. So you have this image of this Indian savage that's depicted in a lot of these markers. And so here's just one example. This is one of the markers in this area put up by DAR folks, and it's emphasizing Native American savagery, even though it's really ostensibly about the Sullivan Expedition. So, okay. So that's what I'm arguing. In Pennsylvania, you have the Wyoming story that comes up at the marker dedications. It keeps coming up. When you go across the border into New York, people don't mention the Battle of Wyoming or the Wyoming Massacre. They don't even really know what it is. So in New York, you have a very different narrative. So in New York, I'm going to just go to the next slide because I don't want to run out of time. You had a centennial celebration in New York for the one-pitch battle I mentioned. What's interesting there is when the, people decided in 1879 to celebrate this battle, it sort of was an afterthought. They spent a lot of time trying to figure out, well, where was it? What should we call it? And so they basically invented this celebration. So the Sullivan Expedition wasn't really something that many New Yorkers were thinking about that much at the time. But then after the centennial, a lot of people were putting together journals of the soldiers and publishing, and led to a lot of scholarship. After that time, when it came time for the 150th anniversary, New York really went through a kind of Revolutionary War fanfare. And this started in part because the state gave funds to a state historian, and so he planned large pageants for the Battle of Saratoga, lots of other large events. And it is at this time that he started thinking about how to narrate the Sullivan Expedition for New Yorkers. And he's the one who decided to add Clinton to the official title. Clinton is the name of one of the generals under Sullivan, but he was also the nephew of the first governor of New York, and the Clinton family is a really prominent New York family. And so what this does is it makes the Sullivan Expedition seem to be a New York thing, right? Part of this was also an enormous pageant, and so he organized a pageant with casts of 7,000 in each of 3 towns. So that's 21,000 people reenacting the Sullivan Expedition in 1929. What gives you a sense of how different this was at the time is the fact that at the end of the pageant, in each of these locations, they had grown cornfields. And so at the climax of the pageant, they would burn these cornfields, kind of recreate what had happened, which really gives you a sense of a very different kind of mindset at the time. You also find at the end of the pageant a kind of celebration of settler colonialism. So you start to have a narrative in New York where the story is that Sullivan came in, cleared out the Native Americans for us, and then along came the settlers, hooray, you know, and now we're here. So that's the story that's told, which is actually patently false, because the Haudenosaunee came back and they were removed from a lot of their land, largely through the machination of state officials in the 1820s, 1830s. So the actual reduction of their reservations occurred much later. So it wasn't Sullivan who cleared the area. And you can see this sort of rendition in the marker text all over New York. You have signs that say this. Check the aggressions of the Indians and the English. Well, we know now that that's not the truth, right? It actually inflamed the Haudenosaunee further. It also says extends westward the dominion of the United States. That's, you know, eventually that did happen, but it wasn't a direct, cause, like immediate thing. So I was interested in why the state historian would put up so many markers that are telling a slightly incorrect story. And there's more to this story, too. So what I learned, there was a large Haudenosaunee land claims lawsuit pending at the same time. There was a commission created to settle a minor Oneida sovereignty issue, and the commission ended up making the startling conclusion that a huge amount of New York's land had been taken from different Haudenosaunee nations illegally. And they published this in 1922, and you can see the headlines here. Haudenosaunee got together, they organized a land claim lawsuit, and they put it together and they filed it. And you can see here, New York Times is saying Indians claim half of New York. So this is a problem. Well, the lawsuit doesn't succeed. But what I find really interesting is the whole time it is pending, the state historian is figuring out ways to mark the land in New York to say that Sullivan Clinton claimed the land and got the land for us. And so I think that they are somewhat connected, these stories. In May 1929, the Haudenosaunee could have taken this to the Supreme Court. And so we don't know what would have happened, but they had run out of funding at that point. So when you look at these historical markers, you get the sense that what they're also doing is they kind of represent this anxiety about the land in New York. And they seem to be saying, this land really is ours. Sullivan Clinton got it for us. This is how it happened. So that's the kind of our general argument I'm going over it really quickly in the first part of the book. I want to get to the Haudenosaunee Cultural Center. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you images from the commemorations that are still ongoing that are dealing with this story in one way or the other. So I attended these regular commemorations. And I found that what the story told on the markers is pretty much what people are still repeating today. But this section of the book has some hilarious, well, I don't know if they're hilarious, some funny interviews and things. So I did find people who are also changing the narrative. And some people are starting to put up new markers telling a slightly different story. The neighbors of the Onondaga Nation put up this historical marker, and they wanted to confront the sense that Haudenosaunee are long gone and they've declined and they no longer exist. And so you see that you learn from this marker that they are still meeting, and the Confederacy still holds meetings, and the Onondaga Nation is thriving and so forth. So they're confronting that narrative of Indian extinction. But the greatest interventions are really being carried out by Haudenosaunee cultural centers. So at these centers, you find a very different framing. Language is different. So this expedition was experienced from people living in their homelands. So they aren't going to talk about it as an expedition. They're going to talk about it as the invasion, outsiders coming in. These are the raids. They talk about it as the apocalypse, the whirlwind, the burning. Also, the periodicity is very different. When the story starts for them is very different, or when history starts for them is very different. So in many of the small towns in New York or Pennsylvania, the Revolutionary War is kind of the start of their history. But Haudenosaunee have been in this area for time immemorial. So at these cultural centers, the Sullivan Expedition is just a little blip in time. So their history starts centuries before. Sullivan also wasn't the first invader. And so a lot of these cultural centers talk about the French and Denonville and the attacks on their villages by French, the the arrival of missionaries and so forth. So they talk about all sorts of attacks on tribal sovereignty. Some of these centers don't mention Sullivan at all. At this center in Salamanca, the expedition appears within the context of the Kinzua Dam. This was a dam that flooded out many whole settlements of the Seneca, and it was carried out with a decree signed by JFK, by Kennedy. And so you have these heartbreaking oral testimonies of people talking about watching their houses being burned, and then they say, that was kind of like Sullivan. So the Sullivan Expedition comes in that kind of relationship. But the exhibits here emphasize the Seneca language, Haudenosaunee philosophy and religion, and also contemporary Seneca Nation politics and so forth. This cultural center is dedicated to art and culture, contemporary Haudenosaunee artwork and other indigenous artwork. And it also talks a lot about the Treaty of Canandaigua. So we learn in all of these centers about more recent land thefts, the boarding school horror, threats of removal, threats of termination, the imposition of U.S. citizenship, the denial of border crossing privileges that were promised in 1790s, the taking of land for throughways and power plants, recent fights over cigarette taxes, the pollution of sacred lakes. And we also learn about activism throughout and victories and resilience. And I went to this one as well. Here, they're spending a lot of time trying to teach local community members that they still are alive and well. And so they have a lot of programming reaching outward. At Scano, it's devoted to the great law of peace, the constitution of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the teachings that offer a blueprint as to how to live a good life. And here, again, you find Sullivan in the middle of a timeline. So it's not the start of their story. It's also not the end of their story. So in this timeline of encounters with others, you have a timeline that talks about the doctrine of discovery, and then it goes into the present day. So it kind of gives you pause when you come there. So these are community centers that are forward-looking, that emphasize survivance and resistance, and they're also places of language revitalization. So I want to conclude with some concluding remarks, which is, I've kind of come to my end here. We've encountered a lot of different ways that Washington's Indian expedition has been remembered publicly. I was most surprised by the way local context really matters, how people of Pennsylvania see the conflict one way, people in New York see it another way. It's filtered through very different local issues. George Washington features as a hero in most narrations of the Revolutionary War, but this may not be the case for some of the people he attacked or he had attacked. And we saw in Washington's orders a command for Sullivan to instill fear in the populace, and that fear was achieved. And so in 1794, a really famous Seneca warrior, known in English as Corn Planter, made this statement in a speech that he gave with chiefs to Washington, saying, when your army entered the country of the Six Nations, we called you the town destroyer. And that when that name is heard, women turn pale and so forth. So in the Seneca language now, Washington is known as town destroyer. That's the meaning of his name in the Seneca language. That's also how people refer to President of the United States. And it sort of identifies the individual, the institution, and the people responsible for the devastation. So this is one way the Sullivan Expedition is remembered. It's embedded in the Seneca language. You can also see another way it's remembered through the white settler Sullivan commemorative complex, which seemed to celebrate this destruction. They seem to be telling a story of Native American loss and decline, as if these towns represented the last of the Haudenosaunee, and telling a replacement narrative, like they were here, but now we are, kind of thing. But the Haudenosaunee cultural centers, on the other hand, are emphasizing the present day and the future, and they constitute a really important lasting intervention, confronting the sort of old-fashioned versions of the story that are found all around them on roads everywhere. So they're forward-looking, and they're teaching non-Haudenosaunee people the key values and beliefs of their communities and leading forward with community building. They intervene in the Sullivan story in the best way possible, partly by continuing to thrive. And so despite Washington's orders to prevent these towns from growing crops, corn is still being grown by Haudenosaunee people. And this persistence is kind of beautifully depicted by this quilt by a Mohawk artist who shows an image of contemporary people with their bounty of corn, and then Washington's orders to Sullivan on the side saying, stop, prevent them from planting more. For anyone here interested in new ways to consider how to think about the Sullivan Expedition or how to commemorate 1779, I encourage you to travel to the Haudenosaunee Cultural Centers first and take part in their community building programming. After these visits, you'll see the worn out kind of old-fashioned historical signs with a completely new eyes. We like to use anniversaries to look back to see where we've been and to seek foundational morals and values. But how we approach these pasts can evolve. We don't need to be stuck in past commemorative practices. Ideas and practices advance. So it's time to consider Washington's invasion of the Haudenosaunee homelands in a new way. Communities across the two states now are very eager for new perspectives and new commemorative forms. I've learned through writing this book that there are ways to recognize terrible pasts while looking forward with generosity, optimism, and hope. That's a message that I find just a few hours north of us, and I encourage you to travel to the cultural centers to find out. I've tried to leave time for questions, so thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. We've got a variety. I certainly have questions, but we'll go to our guest first.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. Over the last couple of weeks, there's been a lot of discussion about whether soldiers have an obligation to follow illegal orders. And I'm wondering whether, in your research, there was remorse or pushback or whatever from the Continental soldiers who were on this what had to be a rather, traumatic mission for them.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the soldiers' journals have been published and compiled into large collections, and I've read through them, and there are a few people who would say things like, "This hurts my feelings." It's not easy to destroy somebody's house. This hurts my feelings. So some were open enough to write that down. In Haudenosaunee oral history, people sometimes argue too that we don't know the full story, that some people refused to do these orders, or some people had to do them by getting really drunk. That's some of the stories that I've heard. So I think there was some discomfort. It doesn't come out in all of the narratives, but yeah. Should I call on people, or?
Thank you. Oh. Thank you so much. This was such a wonderful talk, and I'm so excited to read the book. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about this local context side, which I think is so fascinating. And you talked a little bit about the differences in some of the different Haudenosaunee cultural centers, but I was wondering if you saw any sort of similar to what you saw between Pennsylvania and New York, differences in terms of how this is presented based on longer history, in terms of like the original locations of these nations or their relationships to the British or the US or the French. Or just if you could talk a little bit more about those differences.
Well, so I did see, I didn't see a real distinction in how the Revolutionary War is presented, even though, the Oneida Cultural Center, you would think, would emphasize the fact that some Oneida were on this mission, but they don't really emphasize that, but they do emphasize their service. And so the proud service on behalf of the Americans during the American Revolution, it was featured when I went there. And that was the main distinction. Some of the other cultural centers really avoid that whole topic. So I don't know if that's enough to answer your question, or what you find is each of these centers are a little bit different. The Scano Center is partly run by the Onondaga Historical Association, so it's partly a sort of nonprofit and Onondaga Nation, so that's a kind of interesting dance that they have to play. Ganondagan is actually a state historic site, so that has to follow under New York State regulations. But Ganondagan, I hear, is now going to have its own emphasis in advance of the Sullivan Expedition commemorations on peace and the Haudenosaunee effort, or philosophy and attempt to create peace among communities. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a great talk. I learned a lot. When I went to school, I knew nothing about any conflict really at all between the U.S. and the indigenous peoples at all. So could you give us, was there really any prior to Sullivan, was there really any significant conflict ongoing?
Oh, that's a big question. Some people, yes, some people would say that U.S. history is a history of like 500 years of conflict with indigenous communities, so I think there is a lot, yeah. Operating separately, trying to hold on to their territory, sometimes conflict with each other in deciding which way to go and so forth, but yeah, I could give you some sources if you're interested, yeah. There's some great new books out.
Thank you for attending Philadelphia. I want to ask you, how long did the project take you to research?
Oh, it took about 10 years. I'm also a professor, so I had to go back and forth with teaching, but it took about 10 years because I had to spend a lot of time in the archives, New York State Archives, and also the Pennsylvania State Archives. And I also had to travel back and forth a lot to different communities. So
my other question is, I noticed beautiful views you had of those cultural centers. Some of them were on rivers. Are most of them on rivers?
some of them are not. Yeah, one is on a hill. One is on a hill where there used to be a big There used to be a big settlement, a big Seneca settlement.
Would you say most of them are in rivers, or you can't?
I would say the cultural centers that I looked at were, I would say half and half. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. How about the word Iroquois? How did that become about that, rather than the name that you use? And also about the Citizens Law of 1924, if you could describe a little bit about that also.
Okay. So the Iroquois used to be a name that was in the French, that was it was kind of a derogatory name, yeah, which has something to do with snakes. And Haudenosaunee means people of the longhouse, and so that's a name that Haudenosaunee people use today for themselves. Because the other was Haudenosaunee is an autonym, it's a name for the people that they're using for themselves. The other was a name that outsiders gave them, yeah. The Citizenship Law of 1924 came about, and it was partly because of that law that the lawsuit had to be dismissed. And so that came about through a lot of work from different people, different activists. There were different attempts to come up with a citizenship law. Some of the earlier efforts had all sorts of restrictions and requirements for people, and this was a blanket law that was finally passed in 1924. It may have a lot to do with the work of somebody named Joseph Dixon, who was really trying to advocate for citizenship, and then after World War I, he was doing a lot of research with Native American veterans to say, hey, look, these people served, and you need to offer them citizenship. But that wasn't universally loved by all Native American groups, because it also, there was concern that it would challenge tribal sovereignty. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi. You talked a little bit about how in the Haudenosaunee, the Oneida and the Tuscarora, factions of the Oneida and Tuscarora side with the Colonial Army. Can you talk a little bit about if they were involved in the Sullivan campaign as part of that? And then does that reflect how, say, in the Oneida Cultural Center, they talk about the Sullivan campaign versus in, say, the Seneca Cultural Center?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Sullivan expected a whole lot of Oneida soldiers, and he was really upset because they didn't show up. And so I think there was real deep inner conflict about serving against your people. So he, your former community. He did have a few scouts, and he also complained that the scouts didn't seem to know anything about the land that they were traveling on. So I think that there were some people that did serve, and I'm sure in the Oneida community they would be seen as heroes, but maybe with some conflicted feelings. But there is a fair amount of evidence when you read what Sullivan wrote that they weren't really doing the job he wanted them to do. Yeah, so.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today, but I'm sure Dr. Smith would be glad to chat some more afterwards. But please join me in thanking her for the great presentation.
Thank you very much.